We're going to begin tonight with the latest improvement plans for the Port of Corpus Christi. Hundreds of dignitaries from here and around the state gathered at the Ortiz Center this morning as the port officially kicked off its long-awaited, nearly $400 million ship channel expansion project. The project will coincide with the completion of the new harbor bridge and will ultimately allow our port to handle much larger ships and spur a lot more economic development. Our Brian Burns was at today's announcement ceremony, and he has more on this top story. Brian?
Well, Joe, every official who had a pivotal role in helping the port get the clearances and the federal funding for this project was recognized at this morning's ceremonies. The gathering included at least 10 of the speakers throwing a ceremonial switch to kick off the $347 million channel improvement project that's about to get underway. That project will see the ship channel dredged from 47 feet to 54 feet deep and widen the channel to over 530 feet.
Certainly a momentous day in the history of South Texas as we kick off the Corpus Christi Ship Channel Improvement Project. This has been 30 years in the making, so we're extremely excited.
Port CEO Sean Strawbridge introduced several key players, from commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to members of the Port Board and local, state, and federal delegations, including keynote speaker Congressman Michael Cloud.
It's an exciting project to champion and present the case on behalf of our district to the President, to Congress. We're on the forefront of this transition from being an energy-dependent nation to an energy-dominant nation.
The history of the 93-year-old port was recapped with a short video presentation. State Representative Todd Hunter says the efforts on behalf of the port have made the area stand out.
The greatest thing is the state of Texas knows who we are.
Hunter predicts the area will be the hottest part of Texas in 5 years due to increased business at the port and continued expansion of local industry. Another short film showed the dredging equipment that's expected to be used by the Great Lakes Dredging Company that will do the work. Strawbridge also announced that the dredging is expected to be completed well ahead of schedule.
We're excited about the new, larger equipment that the dredging contractor is going to be bringing here next month. We think that that will allow us to finish early, perhaps as early as December of this year.
4, 3, 2, 1.
The channel improvements will allow larger ships to enter the harbor and load and unload much larger cargoes. Joe?
A lot more to come on that, Brian.